Okay, here we go. So the name of the parsha means Mishpatim, which means ordinances, and is found in Exodus chapter 21. Following the revelation at Sinai, God legislates a series of laws for the people of Israel. These include the laws of the indentured servant, for penalties for murder, kidnapping, assault, and theft, civil laws pertaining to redress of damages, the granting of loans, and the responsibilities of the four guardians, and the rules governing the conduct of justice by courts of law. Also included are laws warning against mistreatment of foreigners, the observance of the seasonal festivals, and the agricultural gifts that are to be brought to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the prohibition against cooking meat and milk, and the mitzvah of prayer. Altogether, the Parsha of Mishpatim contains 53 commandments, 23 imperative commandments, and 30 prohibitions. God promises to bring the people of Israel to the Holy Land and warns them against assuming the pagan ways of its current inhabitants. Okay, the final paragraph is a little bit tricky. The placement of the final paragraph, we discussed this a little bit yesterday, but the people of Israel proclaim, we will do and we will hear all that God commanded us. You probably heard Na'aseh v'nishma, the idea that when God asked the Jewish people to accept the Torah, or if they want to accept the Torah, they said, we will do and we will hear, meaning first do and then try to understand. That appears in this week's Parsha. Leaving Aaron and Hur in charge of the Israelite camp, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and remains there for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Torah from God. Okay. What's a little bit tricky about the final paragraph is that the final paragraph seems to be discussing the events of the giving of the Torah leading up to and actually the giving of the Torah, revelation at Sinai. There's a big debate between Rashi and Nachmanides, just to name the two major camps. Nachmanides says that the final paragraph of this nutshell, meaning the final reading of the Torah of this parsha, actually occurs after the giving of the Torah. So everything is in chronological order. You have the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the 10 Commandments. Then you have God giving to us all the laws in this week's parsha, and then God tells Moshe to ascend the mountain again, and everything is fine. There's no problem with the chronology of the verses. Rashi, however, says no. The final paragraph is referring to the giving of the Torah, so it's really out of order, which is one of the things we have to discuss. We discussed it yesterday. Maybe we'll come to it today from different angles. We'll see. But what emerges from Rashi is that the giving of the Torah that we read about last week, the story, the narrative continues this week. And in between, many of the laws of the Torah which were said after the 10 Commandments were given, were sandwiched in between. In other words, you have the revelation at Sinai, you have the civil law, and then we go back to the revelation at Sinai at the final reading of this week's Parsha. And if that's the case, Rashi quotes the sages that say Ein muktam mu'uchar b'Torah. He doesn't quote it here, but maybe he does. I don't remember. But in general, the principle is that it's okay for the Torah to be out of chronological order, but when it does, you would have to explain why that is, and that's one issue we have to keep our eye on. So that's just a little bit of the nutshell. If anybody has anything specific that intrigues you in this parsha has, like I said, has many of the laws. The first paragraph has about 2 tractates of Talmud analyzing the first paragraph of this nutshell: laws of guardians, laws of servants, laws of damages. So it's kept a lot of Jews busy for a long time. So there's a lot to say and a lot to think about. Okay, so let's go to the parsha, and let's think about, before we think about anything else, even before the name of the parsha, we could think about the first letter. The first letter of the parsha. The first letter of the parsha is ve'ela, and these. In English, it's two words, ve'ela, and these, the prefixes. But in Hebrew, the and is a prefix, the word ve'ela. And ve'ela is a little bit of a problem. Rashi is going to have to address it, as we're going to see in a moment. What's the problem with ve'ela and? And is a continuation. And you don't necessarily start a sentence with and, okay, or a chapter, but whatever. Okay, putting that aside. In Hebrew, you're doing the and. But the question is, what is it a continuation to? In other words, in last week's parsha, we read about the 10 commandments. We read about a few commandments that God says after the 10 commandments, sort of reiterating the 10 commandments, not to make gods of gold and silver. And all of a sudden we jump to civil law. So what's the connection between what we're about to read, the intricacies of civil law, to the revelation at Sinai? That's the issue that the Vav raises. And here we look at Rashi. Says Rashi, the first Rashi on the parsha, and these are the ordinances. Says Rashi, wherever it says these in the Torah, this word is used to separate from what has been stated previously. In other words, Eila, if it would say, these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. So when you say these, it means you're starting a new subject. Rashi continues, when it says and these, it means that it is adding to what has been previously stated. That comes from the Medrash Tanchuma. What do we mean? Thus, just as what has been previously stated, namely the 10 commandments, were from Sinai, these too were from Sinai. So that's one interpretation. There's another interpretation. Okay. What are we saying here? What we're saying here is as follows. When you talk about the civil law, every society has civil law. And civil law, I guess, in most societies is supposed to be logical. And if it's supposed to be logical, then you say, okay, so Moshe comes to the Jewish people and tells them the civil law. So one may think that God is not interested in the civil law. In other words, how the people decide to run their affairs, their business affairs. God sort of lets people figure it out. And indeed, if you look at the Talmud, so there are some areas that are based on the Jewish law, on the verses of the Torah, but there are some areas that the sages say, look, let's do what's reasonable. So the question is, what is the relationship between the Torah, which is moral law, ethical law, religious law, to civil law, which is basically people getting together? And here, Rashi says the first thing we have to understand is the ve'ela, the connector, the vav, and these are the ordinances that you shall place before them, telling you that just like the 10 commandments are from Sinai, the civil law is also from Sinai. So that's the simple interpretation on the vav and the Rashi. But then you go a little bit deeper. The deeper interpretation is as follows. When you talk about the civil law, basically it's logic. And these are mitzvot that the Torah classifies as mishpatim. And we know that there are basically three categories of commandments. There's testimonials, mitzvot that remind us of the past. There's chukim, decrees, things that are not logical. Then there's mishpatim, mitzvot that are logical. So when you talk about logical mitzvot, the question is, why am I doing it? Am I doing it because it makes sense, or am I doing it because it's a commandment? And of course, all the philosophers talk about this. What's the basis of morality? But what the Torah is saying, at least one interpretation of what the Torah is saying, what Rashi is saying, is when you say that these are also from Sinai, we don't just mean that God gave us the law. Okay. What we also mean to say is you have to keep these laws, not because they make sense to you, but because you're accepting the yoke of heaven, you're accepting the morality of God, you're accepting the commandment of Hashem. In other words, the foundation of a society, foundation of people committed to do the right thing, if it's going to be just on logic, then that could be dangerous because logic could be perverted and logic could be bended to justify people's own ambitions. The foundation, therefore, has to be, we do it not because it's logical, we do it because Hashem told us to, And that's the meaning of this is also from Sinai, meaning this was also commanded. And therefore, it's not just telling us the origin, but it's also telling us the attitude that even the logical laws of the Torah we're supposed to keep because the Torah tells us, because Hashem tells us so, because the foundation of morality is human logic, that could be dangerous. Okay, so what do we have so far? We have two interpretations of the Vav, the connector. Number one, it's just telling you that the origin of these laws are from Sinai. One may think that it's logical, so it's just God sort of outsourced it to the people to come up with this with ways of governing themselves. We say no, this comes from Sinai. Second interpretation, we said it's the way you're supposed to keep it. Meaning, we don't do it necessarily because it makes sense, but we do it because God told us to do so, and that's the foundation of the Vav. And then we have a third interpretation. Go ahead, Vicky.
Oh, is that why it says we will do and we will hear?
That's the same attitude, yes. But what we'll do and we will hear could be referring to the Ten Commandments, which, by the way, the Ten Commandments is the same problem. I'm not going into this right now, but the Ten Commandments has the same problem. The problem with the Ten Commandments is that many of the commandments are simple logic. In other words, the Talmud says that if a Torah would not be given, we would learn not to steal from nature. So it says, for example, we would learn from ants. Now, I don't know about this. I've never examined an ant colony, but according to the sages, the ants don't steal from each other. So to come up with a concept that stealing is bad, you don't have to get to Torah. You can look at the ant. And then tzniut, modesty. Modesty, you can learn from the cats. You don't need God tell you not to commit adultery. You could learn the concept of modesty from cats. So yes, some things in the Torah in the Ten Commandments are very spiritual and lofty. Shabbat, I'm the Lord your God. Don't say God's name in vain. Okay, you understand why that has to come from heaven. But so much of the law is basic common sense. And the question is why? Well, God has one opportunity in history to speak to people. He only has 10 things to say. He has a limit of how many tweets he could send out. So what are you telling me? Things that are obvious to everybody. Every society knows you can't steal. You need God to tell me that? And one answer is yes, because what God is telling us is the absolute morality comes from Hashem. Because if you're not going to steal based on your own opinion, based on your own logic, then there will be certain scenarios where your logic will say it's okay to steal or kill or commit adultery. So in the Ten Commandments, you have the idea that God is going to reiterate the most simple and basic foundational logical laws because to tell you that it's not enough to do it because logic dictates. Because logic cannot be your arbitrator of what is truth. Later, you have to understand. So going back to we will do, we will hear. So there's acceptance and then understanding. So you're right. Once you accept it as God's word, now you want to make sure it makes sense to you. Now you want to make sure it is internalized. So,
but as we discussed yesterday, if something that does make sense, it's a good problem to have to mix it in.
Yeah, you have to make it understand, but not as a foundation. Right. You have to start with faith, with acceptance, and then internalization. So there's a very interesting statement in the Talmud. The Talmud says a person should not say pork is disgusting. The pork is disgusting. It's a prohibition. Don't say it's disgusting. Say it's good. But what should I do that God doesn't allow me to eat it? In other words, what is our attitude toward the prohibitions of the Torah? So you can walk around and say things that are against the Torah are disgusting. Talmud says, no, they're actually very beautiful. But what should I do that I don't do it because God didn't tell me to do it. But here comes Maimonides and qualifies the statement. Maimonides says the example the Talmud gives is pork. Pork, B'sar Chazir, is an example of the mitzvot that make no sense. It's a decree. Those mitzvot, you could say it's actually very beautiful. Pork tastes good. However, says Maimonides, when it comes to the laws that make sense, not to kill, not to steal, not to kill, not to steal, do not say it's beautiful to kill and steal. That means there's a moral problem with your character and a moral problem with your way of thinking. So there, Maimonides says it has to revolt you to kill and steal, to commit adultery. So that's to your point that yes, of course we want this to resonate. And if not, you're an unhealthy person morally, right? So of course we're not talking about that. We're saying I only don't kill because God told me. If God wouldn't tell me, then I would love to go kill. No, we're saying even if God wouldn't tell me, I would learn from nature not to kill or not to steal. But that's not the sole reason. It's not the foundation. And that's not Seven Ishma. The foundation is we will accept, and then we will understand. So we seek to internalize. So that's a good point. One more technical answer for the Vav, but it's only semi-technical. It's semi-technical, but it's also a big idea. So we have to try to figure out what's going on here. And connects it to the 10 commandments. Now we have 56 commandments in this parsha out of 613. And if you try to look for an order and try to figure out what is going on, what's with the order of these commandments, why these commandments, it's not 100% clear. And we're not going to go through it right now. But the good news is that there were smart people who tried to explain and clarify the order of the mitzvot in these commandments, in this parsha. And without getting technical, because there's no sort of formula that works 100%, but without getting technical, we could say that almost all of them follow and fit into the themes of the 10 commandments. For example, what's the first commandment? First commandment in this parsha, how to treat a Jewish servant, a Jewish slave. 6 years he can work, 7th year send you out. If you had the 10 commandments before you, and you had to peg this commandment to one of those, the commandment of the Jewish servant to one of the 10 commandments, what would you do? Which one? What is it connected to? So naturally, it's the first commandment. Why? Because it's the first commandment of the civil law. So it makes sense that parallels the first commandment in the 10 commandments. And indeed, what is the first commandment in the 10 commandments? I am the Lord your God. Okay, fine. Who took you out of the land of Egypt, to the house of bondage? So the first commandment says that Hashem took us out of Egypt, and therefore we're free, and therefore a Jew cannot be enslaved. And if he's enslaved, it's only limited time, and then 7th year, you have to let him free. So you see that the first mitzvah in this parsha, in the civil law, is an elaboration of the first commandment. And then you get to mitzvah against killing. That's the 6th. That's the second, the most important one on the left column, the column between man and God. And the bottom line is that if you want to generalize everything in this, most of the laws of the parsha are talking about civil law, protecting someone else's possessions. That could be ultimately, it's all included in not stealing, right? Harming someone else's possessions in some sense is robbing them of property. And also, the final one of the 10 commandments, lo tachmod, don't be jealous, don't covet, don't desire something that doesn't belong to you. And in some sense, what that means is, protect yourself against desiring somebody's things, because then I'm going to go and take it unjustly. So in other words, this entire parsha is a continuation, an elaboration of the 10 commandments, the details of the 10 commandments. If you kept the 10 commandments and you want to know all the details, that would be spelled out in this week's parsha. And that's why you have the vav, the connector, the and that connects it. So far we have 3 reasons. So we spent the last 26 minutes discussing one letter of the parsha. Congratulations, we did one letter. Okay, now we have a few more letters to go before we can say that we actually studied the entire parsha. I want to say one thing about the general category of Mishpatim, the mitzvot, the logical commandments. So we've said that we have 3 categories of mitzvot. We have the Edu testimonials, the mitzvot that remind us of something that happened in the past. For example, Passover is a mitzvah of the past. We celebrate Passover because God took us out of Egypt, and there are other mitzvot in that category. Then there are mitzvot that make no sense. We do them because God told us to do them. For example, not to mix milk and meat, not to mix linen and flax, etc. And then you have Mishpatim, the laws that make sense. Why do we need all 3 categories? So one interpretation I heard recently, a few years ago, I think it's cute, so I'll say it, is because in any relationship, you have to have all 3 forms of connection. So in your relationship, there has to be, one of the things you do, an important thing, is celebrating milestones. So you celebrate your anniversary. What is that? That's Edu, that's testimonials. You're celebrating now for something that happened in the past. was an old joke that I'm not going to say. You know what? I'll say it, but it's a very bad joke, but I'll say it anyway. Okay. What's the best way? What's the joke? What's the best way to remember your anniversary date? You remember your anniversary. To forget it once is the joke. So it's not a good joke, but it's talking about the truth that in a relationship, you want to remember the past because in the past, the relationship was in some sense more new, more exciting, and you want to tap into that energy. So that's the category of edut. Then in a relationship, you have to do things that both parties enjoy, right? We can't always do what you like. So you have to have things that I'm doing and we're doing because we both enjoy. That's Mishpatim. They're logical for us. I'm doing this because it makes sense. This makes me happy. It makes you happy. On the other hand, a relationship, you can't just say, okay, I celebrate my anniversary and we do things that make both of us happy. That's two wonderful components to a relationship. And you cannot have a relationship without those two components. But that cannot be the full relationship. In a relationship, you also have to have what they call commitment. And commitment is I do things, I don't like to do them. They don't make sense to me, but I do them because they're for you, they make you happy. Makes no sense to me. That's the chok, that's the decree. Now, if you think about your own relationship and think about, could you have a relationship missing one of those three legs? The answer is it's not going to be wholesome. And that's why a human relationship mirrors the relationship between the people and God. And therefore, in the relationship between people and God is really the model. And therefore, in our relationship with God, we have all those three elements. We want to celebrate the past. We want to commemorate the time when our youthful love, the way the prophet calls it, when God took us out of Egypt, and other things of the past where there was a tremendous amount of positivity and energy in this relationship. And we want to not just remember it just for the sake of memory, but to relive those experiences. And that's critical. And then we have the relationship with God. Judaism has to make us fulfilled and make us happy, and has to make sense to us, and has to give us meaning and give us excitement in life. That's the Mishpatim, that's the mitzvah that makes sense. And then you have the things, why do you do it? I do it, I don't want to do it. Why do I do it? Because God wants me to. That's commitment. And that's why the relationship has to have all three components to make it complete and make it wholesome. So I think that's cute. I think that's true. It's also cute, but it's also true. So that is a little bit on the word. So we discussed the first letter, and now we discussed the first word of the parsha, and now we can maybe think about starting the parsha. Okay, the problem with this parsha is that it's paralyzing in the sense that there are so many details, and we don't want to get caught up in the details. We want to think about the big picture as well, and think about what are the underlying values. Another problem with this parsha is not a problem, but a good thing is that we've been in this doing these classes for probably 14, 15 years. So I said a lot of things, and I don't want to bore you. So I'm going to try to say things that are a little bit different than we said in the past. But again, if you have any specific thing that you want to talk about, please raise it, and then I'll be happy to talk about it. But in the meantime, I'm going to look for one of these things that I haven't said in the past. Okay, ready? We're going to discuss a little bit of Talmud. We'll read the verse and discuss what the Talmud says in that verse. I'm going to say a law that I haven't said in the past because it made no sense to me. But now someone gave me a nice interpretation, so I'll say it. What we're trying to say here is like this. We're trying to say here that even in the civil law that usually makes sense, there are details that don't make sense. There are certain details that don't make sense. And then there's two attitudes how to deal with those details that don't make sense. One idea is, okay, this is divine law. So even the laws that are supposed to make sense, certain aspects are not going to make sense because it's God's wisdom, which transcends our wisdom. That's one attitude. Okay, so some things make no sense. Too bad. Another way is, no, but this is all part of the Mishpatim, the category of logical law. So you have to break your head and try to figure it out. And if something sounds strange, it's because you're not working hard enough. So whichever attitude you like, you can take. But I'm going to give you a law that makes no sense, seemingly on the surface makes no sense. And we'll read it. We'll read the law. We'll read the Rashi. Well, the verse itself makes sense, but the way the rabbis interpret the law seemingly makes no sense. But then we'll try to say maybe there is some logic here. So let's go. We're going to, before, just to set it up, there's 4 in this parsha. There's what they call nizakin. In English, it's torts, damages. And there are 4 general categories of damages in the Torah. And any damage you can think of is probably, hopefully, included in one of those 4. And each category has different laws and different regulations and different limitations and different ways of thinking about it. And if you start getting to the philosophy of the law, even the underlying logic for the reason why I'm responsible will change. So I'm going to list the 4. And one of them is actually debatable in the Talmud, so I don't want to get into that. But the simple ones is shor and ox. In other words, if my animal damages your animal, and specifically gores, right? The animal gets upset, takes its what do they call it? Horns, and gores your animal. So am I responsible? What did I do wrong? I'm sitting in my house drinking coffee. My animal gored your animal. I'm responsible. What, I'm supposed to sit in the field all day guarding my animals? And if I have 50 animals, what am I going to do then, right? So that's one category. Then you have bor, a pit, and that's what we're going to start with today. If I go in the street and I make a pit, so if I make a pit and somebody trips in the pit, I'm responsible. Logical. You're going to make an obstacle, you're responsible. And then you have fire. If I light a fire, but then ultimately the fire travels and burns your house or your property, I'm responsible. And that is another category. You see, it's not so much that, you see, an ox is my money, but the flame is not my money. You know, it's just a flame and it's intangible. Yeah, but when I light a flame, I got to be careful. And the 4th category is a debate whether it means tooth, meaning my animal eating, as opposed to my animal goring. It's one opinion in the Talmud. And another opinion in the Talmud, no, it refers to a person. Any damage a person will do. The other opinion says a person's damages is not part of the 4 categories. It's a separate category. The 4 is the person's possessions. Okay, so that's the background. So I want to read the verse about making the pit. And I also want to think about, then we'll read the Rashi, which is the analysis of this law. So we're going to get a little taste of Talmudic study. And then we're going to end up with the thing that the rabbis say, which is hard to understand, but then we'll try to understand it. So that's the roadmap for the next couple of minutes. So I'm sorry if you came and you thought it's a Kabbalah class. Today it's going to be more of a Talmud class. Okay. We're reading, what are we reading? We're reading chapter 21 in Exodus, verse 33. I do have I gotta find it inside here.
Page 421.
421. Okay, wonderful. So let's read the verse. And if a person opens a pit, or if a person digs a pit and does not cover it, and a bull or a donkey falls into it. Okay, seems like a fairly common problem. What happens? Verse 34. The owner of the pit shall pay. He shall return money to its owner, and the dead body shall be his. Okay. This is 2 verses on the category of pit. Now, as you see, the Rashis, the very long Rashis, every word in this verse is analyzed by Rashi, analyzed in the Talmud, and Rashi is giving you a little taste. But I want to look at the idea of the last 2 words. V'nafal shama. So this is the scenario. 33 is the case. 34 is the resolution, is the verdict. So 33, a person opens a pit, or a person digs a pit and does not cover it, and a bull or donkey falls into it. Okay. Question is, why does it say bull or donkey? Why does it say bull? What happens if it's a sheep? That's the issue we're dealing with. Now, the reason why this is interesting here is because usually when we talk about the Torah bringing an example, we say it's just an example. So for example, earlier in the parsha, the verse says The verse would say, earlier in the parsha, let's find it. So the verse says, look at verse 28. If a bull gores a man or a woman, and that one dies, meaning the man or woman dies, the bull shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, and the owner of the bull is clear. Okay, I don't want to talk about the case. I just want to talk about if a bull gores a man. What happens if it's not a bull? What happens if it's a buffalo? What happens if it's another animal? Says Rashi, if a bull gores, this law refers to either a bull or any domestic animal, beast, or bird. In other words, any animal that I own, the same law would apply. So why does the Torah say bull? The Torah should say animal. The answer is, says Rashi, for the text spoke of what usually occurs. Literally, diber hakasuv b'hoiva. The Torah talks about a common case. And the common case is that it's the bull that gores, not the goat. So it's not a big problem to ask why the Torah says gore, why the Torah says ox, because ox is just an example, and we bring a common example. Does that make sense? If that's logic, if that's illogical to you, let me know. To me, that sounds logical. That's fine. You say ox, you don't mean ox, you mean any other animal as well. Okay. Ox is just an example. The problem is when you come to the pit, you have a big problem. What's the problem when you come to the pit? There it says, donkey, a bull or a donkey. 1 second. Why do I need 2 examples? If you say it's just an example, bring 1 example. But if you say 2, then maybe it's just these 2 and nothing else. Because if it's everything, bring 1 example, like we brought 1 example before. So when we read that a bull or donkey falls into it, this is a problem. This is a red flag. We'll see how Rashi deals with it and how the sages deal with this problem. But so far, before we continue, I need to make sure that everyone agrees with me that this is a problem. If it would say just 1 verse, donkey, then we say ox or whatever, bull or donkey. If it says 1 example, it's not a problem. It's just an example. The law would apply to any animal. But if it's just an example, then why do you need 2 examples? 2 examples may mean it's exclusively these 2 cases. So that's the problem that we have in this verse. Says Rashi. Rashi is going to prove that when it says bull or donkey, it doesn't mean just bull or donkey. It means all animals. How are you going to prove it? So one of the ways that we did the JLI, we're talking about Book Smart. We're talking about all the various genres of the Torah. And last week we discussed the laws of the Medrash, and we discussed the various ways you can interpret the biblical text. And one of them is what's called a Gzeira Shava. If you have 2 words used in the Torah, I'm not sure if there's a meaning of 1 verse is ambiguous. So one way of deriving meaning is I say, where else has this phrase or this word been used in the Torah? And I can connect those 2 cases and glean meaning from one to another. So in this case, we have ox and donkey. We have bull or donkey. Bull and donkey. Now, I don't know, does it mean just bull and donkey, or does it mean all animals? So what do? I have to look in the Torah for another place where that same phrase appears, bull or donkey. I'm sorry, bull or donkey, yeah. And then
ox and donkey.
Ox and donkey, same thing. Sorry, yeah, ox and donkey. In Hebrew, it's a shor. I get confused because in English it's 1 word for ox and bull. So I'm getting confused. But the bottom line is shor or chamor, an ox or a donkey. It says it here. Maybe it says it elsewhere in the Torah. So we're going to go search the entire Torah now, find an equivalent, a similar phrase, and then figure out from the context over there what it means over there, and then apply it back to here. That's called the Gzeira Shava, comparing 2 verses that are similar. Now, the good news is we don't have to look through the entire 5 books of Moses because the Talmud did it for us, and Rashi is going to quote it. So I just saved you lots of time. So we're very grateful. Says Rashi as follows: a bull or a donkey. The same applies to all domestic animals and beasts. For whenever it says a bull or a donkey, we can derive that it applies to all domestic animals through a Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava is similar wording of shor. Gzeira Shava is that concept when you have 2 words that are similar in 2 different places, that they are linked by the fact that they use the same phrase. So let's see. Where else that does it say this word, shar, which is from the law concerning the Shabbat? As it is stated in the Ten Commandments, we read it last week, in order that your bull and your donkey rest. So that's what it says. It says in the Ten Commandments that Shabbat, not only you have to rest, but your animals have to rest as well. And it says your bull and your donkey. Now, why bull and donkey? What about why other animals? So there we know that it means every domestic animal and beast is just like the bull in reference to this law. How do you know? So we're saying Shabbat, it means all animals. How do you know it means all animals at Shabbat? Well, let's look. For it says elsewhere regarding the Shabbat, you shall not perform any kind of work, neither you nor your son and all your animals. So we know for sure that when it comes to Shabbat, all your animals have to rest, because there's a specific verse in Deuteronomy that says all your animals should rest. In the Ten Commandments, it says your ox and donkey shall rest. Ox and donkey in Ten Commandments about Shabbat means all animals. So about Shabbat. So the same thing here, an animal falling into the pit is all the animals. Any animal falls into the pit, you're responsible to pay. Here too, all animals and beasts are like the bull in reference to the law. So that makes sense, right? So far, you agree with me. We understand that when it says that I'm responsible if I dig a pit, it's not only if your ox falls into it or your donkey falls into it, but it's any other animal. It's any other animal as well. Okay, everything is fine. The only question we have still, so why does the Torah bring two examples? Torah should just say one example. We just said if you say one example, that's everything. So why specify two? So there's an extra word here. And if you read the JLI that we talked about last week, extra word must teach us something. So there's an extra word here. So what do the sages derive? And I'm giving you a warning right now, a trigger warning. What the sages may say right now, may not seem so logical, but hopefully we'll look for some logic. Okay. Says Rashi, the bull and the donkey are mentioned only for us to understand that for a bull that falls into a pit, the owner is liable, but not for a man who falls into a pit. And he is liable for a donkey, but not for the utensils. This comes from Baba Kama, the Talmud, Baba Kama 10b. What is Rashi telling us? The verse says ox or here it says bull. Okay, bull or donkey. Bull says, I'm only responsible if your bull falls into my pit, but not if a person falls into my pit. If a person falls into my pit, I'm not responsible. If it says donkey, meaning if the donkey falls into my pit, I'm responsible. But what happens if on top of the donkey, there was a whole load of vessels? Because that's what the donkey was used for transport. And the donkey falls into my pit and the vessels also break. Here, I'm only responsible for the donkey. The owner of the pit is only responsible for the donkey and not responsible for the vessels. That is what the Talmud derives from this extra word. So we just spent a lot of time establishing the point, but what is the point? The point is when the Torah says ox or donkey. If it would just say ox, ox is an example and applies to all animals. So the first thing Rashi says, the law applies to all animals. How do I know? Because ox and donkey, that phrase, ox and donkey is written by Shabbat and is written here. Just like Shabbat, it applies to all animals. So to here, it applies to all animals. Fine. But so if it applies to all animals, just say one example. Why say two? So we say, okay, so there's extra word. So it's teaching us something. Ox, when you say an ox falls in, that excludes a person, and donkey excludes the vessels. So it's a very strange scenario. I dig a hole in the pot. I'm reckless. I did a hole in the street. I make a pothole. I'm reckless. Your animal falls in. I'll have to pay the animal. The animal may be worth $1,000. On top of the animal may be vessels that are worth $3,000. I'm not responsible. So is that logical? Doesn't seem logical. It's not the simple meaning of the verse. It's the way the Talmud derives laws from the Torah based on the 13 principles that Moshe gave us. Moshe handed down. But then the question is, so what is the logic here? Is there logic here? So an interpretation that I saw recently, I saw like this. And the interpretation says like this. Yes, indeed, it is the responsibility of a person to make sure that their possessions or their actions don't cause damage to somebody else. And that's the primary responsibility. The primary responsibility in this relationship is make sure you don't harm somebody else. That's the primary responsibility. However, that's not to say that a person does not have a responsibility not to be damaged. I also have a responsibility not to be damaged. So don't put yourself in a reckless situation. So what happens if I have a fancy car and I have a great insurance policy and I say, you know what? I don't care. I'm going to park my car in a dangerous neighborhood. It may get stolen. Doesn't matter. I have insurance. And if in any case, they may find the thief and they'll penalize the thief. So we understand that that's not responsible behavior. Yes, the other person shouldn't steal your car. Yes, the other person shouldn't break your window. Yes. But you also have a responsibility to protect your own assets. So when the Torah says that somebody else causes damage, the other person's responsible, what the Torah is saying is the primary responsibility is on the other person. However, that does not mean the Torah is absolving the person himself from protecting his own assets. And therefore, possibly, this is the logic that the Torah is telling you. The Torah is telling you that if I have my donkey and the pots on top of my donkey, and the donkey dies, and the pots are broken. Usually the pots are broken are less damage than the donkey, but okay. We're not saying that the owner of the pit gets all the responsibility. Sometimes, in some scenarios, if it's talking about vessels, the owner of the donkey is responsible to make sure that your donkey doesn't fall into a pit. Yeah, but the other guy built the pit, he shouldn't have built it. Agreed. And that's why he pays the greater share of the damage. But there's going to be a case to tell you, which seems on the surface is a strange case, that if my donkey with the suitcases fall into a pit and it all gets ruined, the owner of the pit only has to pay for the donkey, but is absolved for paying for the luggage. That doesn't sound logical unless you think about and say what the Torah is trying to do is trying to divide the responsibility. Yes, the primary responsibility is not to cause damage to somebody else, but you also have responsibility to protect your own assets, and you can't, and if you don't, and if you're reckless by the sense of not protecting your own assets, you can't shift the entire burden to the other person. By the way, that's also the reason for the law that a person, the Talmud says that this happens is more logical. The Talmud says this explicitly, that if I dig a pit and a person falls into my pit, I'm not responsible. And the Talmud basically says a person has the responsibility to look where they're walking. So obviously today, the Talmud, I don't know if it would apply, but today people are walking down the street looking at their phones. In fact, they're driving down the street looking at their phones instead of at the road. So that is not the ethical thing to do. In other words, that's not the ethical thing to do. In other words, if I am walking down the street, it's my responsibility to make sure I don't get hurt. But why did my friend put an obstacle? Okay, but you have a responsibility to protect yourself. And the same is true about the animal, but the animal is not as wise as the person. So the owner of the pit will have to pay for the animal. But if there's a lesser damage to the vessels, which usually is lesser, then the owner of the donkey is responsible because the owner of the donkey also has some responsibility to protect his own assets. So this is a little taste of Talmud with a little bit of showing how the Talmud derives the law, how it seems like the Talmudic law is not that logical, but hopefully we at least attempted to present a interpretation to make it logical in the sense that we at least understand what the sages are trying to do and what the sages are trying to say. So this is a taste of the Talmud. What I'm going to do now, I think there's so many more laws in the Torah, but now we'll go to the end of the parsha. We'll go to the story. Again, we go back to a description of the Ten Commandments. There's also, a description of the preparation for the giving of the Torah. There's also a very strange, I don't want to say it's always strange by definition, a cryptic description of the Jewish people seeing God. Now, it's obviously a metaphor, but whenever the Torah tells you they saw God, and this is what God looked like, or what was under his feet, it's a very strange, it's always curious to see what is this metaphor alluding to. So I think we're going to turn to that at the last page of the Parsha. But in the meantime, if anyone has any comments or questions on what we said till now, please share. Otherwise, we shift from the Talmud to more of philosophy and Kabbalah. So I could send you off with a little bit of a taste of everything today. Okay, so we're reading here, chapter 24, verse 1. In the Art Scroll, it's on page 441. Like I said, there's a debate of when this is happening, but Rashi says clearly and explicitly that this story happens before the Ten Commandments, so it's out of chronological order. Says Rashi, and to Moses he said, God said, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and prostrate yourselves from afar. Says Rashi, and to Moses he said, come up. This section was actually said before the Ten Commandments were given. That comes from the Medrash, Mechilta. On the 4th of Sivan, come up was said to him, to Moses, Medrash Tov. In other words, this is all the preparation of the giving of the Torah. So the fact that we already read the giving of the Ten Commandments, don't let that confuse you. We're going back to give the narrative from another perspective. Moses shall come and approach the Lord, but they shall not approach, and the people shall not ascend with him. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, and all the ordinances. And all the people answered in unison and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Later is the more famous one in verse 7. And he took the book of the covenant and read it within the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord spoke, we will do and we will hear. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, meaning first we'll do it, and then we're going to seek to understand it. Okay, then there's the covenant. Moshe takes the blood, puts it on the people. Okay. Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel ascended to Mount Sinai. But the Medrash explains they didn't go all together. They didn't all go together. Moshe was in the highest level. Then there's Aaron. Then there's Aaron's two sons, and then the 70 elders. Verse 10 is a very cryptic verse. And they perceived the God of Israel. Okay, we have no description of God because God is undefined. But they sense the presence of God. But then beneath his feet was like the forming of a sapphire brick and like the appearance of the heavens for clarity. What does that mean? I don't know. But it seems to be saying that God has feet, okay? God doesn't have feet, so it's a metaphor. But under his feet, you have sapphire brick, not a sapphire stone, but a sapphire brick, and like the appearance of the heavens for clarity. So it's a clear sapphire brick. So what does this mean? Obviously, this is cryptic. This is a metaphor. The question is, what does this trying to tell us and what the message is for us? So we have to think about this and try to unpack this imagery. Okay, so let's start. Where do we start? We have to start with Rashi. First, Rashi, we're not going to get into. Rashi says that the fact that they perceived the God of Israel was a problem, was a sin. We'll leave that alone for right now. What do they see? Under his feet was like the forming of a sapphire brick. What is the sapphire brick doing in heaven? It's just a strange thing to describe. Says Rashi like this: it was before him at the time of the bondage, to remember Israel's straits, that they were enslaved in the making of bricks. This is from Leviticus Rabbah, the Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah says like this: why is there a brick under God's feet? Why does God have a brick? Why does he have bricks? What is he building? So if you go back to the story of Exodus, to the story of the bondage, of the slavery, primarily what the Jewish people did in Egypt, they built buildings out of bricks. They actually formed the bricks. The Torah describes that at some length. So God places a brick before him when they're in bondage, when the Jewish people are enslaved. So God could remember Israel's pain. That is the sapphire brick. What does it mean? And like the appearance of the heavens for clarity, since they were finally redeemed, there was light and joy before him. That's what Leviticus Rabbah, that Medrash continues. In other words, during the bondage of the Israelites, the sapphire brick clouded the heavens, but after the exodus of the heavens became clear and not a cloud was in sight. Okay, what are we saying here? we're saying is like this. What Rashi is saying is like this. And what's the message here? The Jewish people see God. What do they have to know about God? What's the most important thing God could tell the Jewish people? This is not just the relationship between God as the creator, commanding the people what to do, and the people are just the subjects and just going to fulfill God's will. What's happening here is we're trying to create a relationship. The sages refer to the giving of the Torah like the marriage between God and the people. Okay, so what do you have to know? What's the most important thing the Jews have to know? The most important things the Jews have to know is that God cares about them. That's all they have to know. That's the most important thing to see. And that's why, what do they have to see? The brick. When we were in pain, God thought about it. God was cognizant of our pain. When the pain ended and we were released, that brings joy to God. That is the most important thing for a relationship. Somebody once said, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So this is what's happening here. And that's how Rashi interprets this idea that sapphire brick, if you're in a relationship with somebody, the most important thing they have to know is if they're suffering, you feel the pain or you're cognizant of it. If you're happy, they're happy. That's one level. But there's there's another Hasidic interpretation, which I want to mention here briefly. We only have like a minute left, but we'll mention it briefly. When you talk about a brick, so we talked about that. We always talk about this when we talk about the Tower of Babel, which is in the beginning of the book of Genesis. The people in Babylonia create this unbelievable modern technology called the brick, and they build this Tower of Babel, and they're so arrogant because they think they can protect themselves against God because they had the modern technology. They were cutting edge technology. Cutting edge technology was the brick. How so? Because if you want to build, you would usually get stone. And stone you get from the mountain, from the quarry. Stone is a natural phenomenon. Brick is a metaphor, not a metaphor. Brick is man-made. It's a man-made stone. You take the earth, you put it in hay, you burn it, you figure out how to make a stone, especially in a place where there are no stones. In Babylonia is a valley, there are no stones. You can't build a building, you can't build a skyscraper if there's no stones. Well, unless you come up with this modern technology called man-made stone. Man-made stone is the brick. Okay. The Jewish people are looking at the sky, at the heavens. They sense the revelation. They sense God, whatever that means. But what do they see? They see a sapphire brick. Could you think of two opposites? And like the essence of the heavens for purity. Brick is earth. Sapphire is light. The essence of the heaven for clarity represents spirituality, light. It's clear, it's transparent. And on the other hand, you say there's a sapphire brick, which is almost a contradiction by definition, because sapphire is a stone, not a brick, and brick is man-made, and brick is earth, and sapphire is beautiful as light, and the essence of the heaven is clarity. So what's happening here? What they're seeing, say the Hasidic commentaries, is they're seeing the purpose of the Torah. The purpose of the Torah is that the people take a physical object, whatever mitzvah you're dealing with, and you take a physical object and you make it holy. And what happens when you take a physical object and make it holy? First of all, it's considered a brick because it's man-made. But the man-made brick that you think is earth really begins to shine like a sapphire and becomes as clear and as transparent of the existence of God to the existence of God like the heavens themselves. In other words, the ability to take a brick and make it like heaven is exactly what they sense at the giving of the Torah, because that is exactly the purpose of the entire Torah. So that's the two interpretations of what this mysterious sapphire brick is. We may have mentioned this in the past. I think we have, but it's always good to learn new things as we did today about the pit, but also to polish up the past a little bit because we have to relive it and re-experience it. So thank you very much for joining. Comments, questions are welcome in the sense that are not just we welcome it, but we want it. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and a good rest of the week and a good Shabbat, and we'll see each other in good health, God willing.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Thank you. Wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Beatrice. Be well.
You well.